And today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 7th of June of 2026. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine. And according to information we have today, Zelensky came to London. Today, Starmer will meet Zelensky, Macron, and Merz in London for negotiations on Ukraine. The Guardian. The leaders will discuss further support for Ukraine's security guarantees and possible steps to advance the peace process, the publication writes. So this is a media version, but we understand that these four are going to talk what to do next with the Russians. The thing is that the Russians, despite the situation that the Ukrainians managed to create through Zaporozhye, Kherson, Crimea, through these territories, we are talking about fuel crisis. Despite this situation, despite long-range attacks carried out by the Ukrainians with thousands of drones since the beginning of probably this year, despite the fact that Ukrainians attacked the city of St. Petersburg, despite all these things, we see that the Russians are not changing their positions. The Russians are staying on their position. The Russians want the Ukrainians to capitulate, and we understand that nothing as of this evening of the 7th of June, we see that nothing can change position of the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. And this is exactly what these four leaders are going to talk about. They understand that if they want to force the Russians to accept the demands and the position of the European countries, they need to force the Russians using military means. And the only possible way how to force the Russians to accept anything, at least to accept the possibility of a meeting with the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, between Putin and Zelensky, is to probably start providing Ukrainians with cruise missiles that the Ukrainians would be able to use, not to attack through, let's say, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson or Crimea regions, but to use cruise missiles like Storm Shadow missiles, like Scalp missile, to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia in the direction of the capital of the Russian Federation, Moscow, or in the direction of the city of St. Petersburg or something like this. So the Ukrainians need more weapons, more long-range weapons, and they believe, the Western countries and Zelensky, that this situation may force the Russians to accept the current situation and to accept that it's time to start negotiations, direct negotiations between Putin and Zelensky. But the problem is that the Russians, despite the current critical situation, especially through the southern regions like Crimea, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, despite the fuel crisis that is currently developing and intensifying through these territories, the Russians are searching for a solution for the situation, and it seems that the Russians managed to found. For example, during the previous 24 hours, lots of videos were published on this matter. For example, in this video, we can see how a Russian soldier was destroying and bringing down the Ukrainian drone that was flying deep inside of the territory of Russia. This is the Yolka anti-drone system, and here we can see how exactly this anti-drone system works. The Russians managed to capture the target in the sky, and then as a result of this attack, the Ukrainian drone was destroyed. During the day, we also received another update on this matter. The Russians have created another drone, anti-drone, and the Piranha Design Bureau will soon begin a serial production of the interceptors of drone, and which means that the Russians in coming 2, 3, or maybe 4 months will be able to start producing thousands of these drones, and right exactly from these very moments, the situation will begin stabilizing. The Russians understand this, and the Russians understand that they need to wait for just 1, 2, 3, or 4 months, and then they will be able to establish control over the sky, over the territory of Russia. This is the first step, and Zelensky and the Western countries understand this as well. They understand that maybe now they managed to get the initiative in their hands. Maybe now they can control the sky over Zaporozhye, Kherson, Crimea regions, but they understand that in coming weeks, in coming months, the Russians will stabilize the situation, and the Russians will be able to establish proper supply and support of their forces and civilians with fuel and everything civilians need. So this is the situation, and which means that the Russians most likely will not accept anything from the Western countries, and the Russians will continue. Meanwhile, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the territory of Ukraine with drones, and during the previous night we received a report published by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine that during the previous nights the Russians used 236 drones, which means that somewhere during the previous 24 hours the Russians have already used around 400 drones and missiles and bombs to attack the territory of Ukraine. And as usually these days, the Russians are mainly focused on gas stations. For example, during the previous day we received at least 2 reports that 2 gas stations through the northern parts of Ukraine were destroyed. One of the gas stations was destroyed in the area of the settlement of Kuryukovka. In these pictures we can see the consequences of attack. Another gas station was destroyed in the area of the settlement of Shostka. In this picture we can see a gas station that was completely reduced to ruins as a result of the Russian attack. And probably if we counted every single gas station that the Russians destroyed since the beginning of this year, probably the number would be more than 40 or maybe even 50 gas stations already. And this is a very big number, and obviously the fuel crisis intensifies not just for the Russians but also for the Ukrainians, at least through the eastern and the northeastern parts, from those parts of Ukraine that the Ukrainians, the armed forces of Ukraine, are using as a launching site. Furthermore, the Russians began establishing complete fire control over the main logistic line between the city of Sumy and the city of Kharkiv. These days, pro-Ukrainian sources began publishing lots of updates that everything that uses this road can be attacked by Russians with drones, and we start receiving first pictures and first videos on this matter. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainians were making a video or were filming the situation along supply line between Sumy and Kharkiv, and as we can see, lots of vehicles were damaged and even destroyed. And the Ukrainians are saying that right now the Russians are not checking whether this vehicle belongs to the armed forces of Ukraine or to a business or to civilians. The Russians attack everything that uses these roads for the logistic purposes, and this is the most important thing. Something similar we can see through the southern regions like Crimea, Kherson and Zaporozhye. Almost every single day we receive a video from this area how Ukrainians attack another fuel truck or something like this. Another important thing is that the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours attacked the M18 road and this bridge, and as a result of attack the bridge was significantly damaged. Right before we started making this video, pro-Ukrainian sources published a video of how exactly they were attacking this territory. Tomorrow we will discuss this video in detail, but if the Ukrainians destroy this bridge, of course this can lead to additional escalation of the fuel crisis in this area, because if Russians lose this bridge, they will lose lots of kilometers for supply and support. They would have to use additional roads or other ways how to supply Crimea with fuel, and not just fuel but even with products and goods and of course missiles, munitions and everything that Crimea uses these days. And this is a very interesting situation because you know that I've noted that we see that almost every single day something new happens through the conflict on the territory of Ukraine. As we discussed several videos ago about the geography of the crisis, geography of the conflict, how geography of the conflict has extended since the beginning of the special military operation. And I'm just trying to tell you that now we see that sometimes the Ukrainians start something new, some new competition through this conflict. Let's say just recently the Ukrainians have started attacking fuel trucks and the logistics of Russians along M14 roads and along, let's say, M20 roads. So we're talking about this territory in Crimea. And just 3 weeks after the Russians began doing the same thing between the city of Sumy and Kharkiv, and the same thing in the northwestern parts of Ukraine. For example, several days ago, the Ukrainians attacked the Zaporozhye nuclear power station and the place where the Russians keep the former materials of this nuclear power station. And for example, today we got a report that the Russians mirrored this attack, and the Russians attacked the Chernobyl power station. So this is how the conflict builds right now. Sometimes the Ukrainians expand, extend, increase, I don't know how to say, the geography, the quality, the quantity of the conflict, and just 2 days after, 2 weeks after, the Russians are doing the same, and after something happens, then we see that the parties continue attacking each other and continue using these tools, and of course and this situation leads to additional escalation. So I'm just trying to tell you that if the Ukrainians destroy the bridge between Crimea and Kherson region, we're talking about the bridge along M18 road, this means that the Russians would be forced to mirror this attack as well. And maybe if the Russians decide to mirror this attack, who knows, maybe the Russians, for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, would start attacking Dnipro bridges. So everything is possible, and we see that the conflict escalates and intensifies. Now let's move further. Furthermore, the Russians attacked the cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipro. During the previous 24 hours, additional explosions and attacks were recorded. We can see black smoke over the city of Dnipro. Probably an object of energy infrastructure was destroyed. The Russians also attacked the city of Zaporozhye. And in this video, we can see the Russian drone that attacked some objects on the edge of the city, probably through its northern part. Here we can see the Russian drone that was attacking something on the surface, and the Russians began attacking the logistic line along the M30 road between the cities of Pokrovsk and Pavlograd. And for example, different sources began publishing lots of updates on this matter. And for example, this is the first video that we have received from this area since the beginning of this year. Here we can see military forces of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Here we can see protection nets along the road, and here we can see several vehicles were destroyed as a result of the Russian attack. So the Russians are mirroring the Ukrainian tactics and the Ukrainian actions that goes, let's say, out of the normal development of the conflict. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the ground. And first, let's talk about the Odessa region. According to information we have, the Ukrainians intensified the building and construction of strongholds and fortifications through this territory. The sources reported about hundreds of vehicles that are involved in the process. The Ukrainians are building layered defense, several layers of defense around the city of Odessa from many directions. And it seems that it's something like a panic we can see right now through the Odessa region, and we can understand this. We can understand why the Ukrainians began building fortifications around the city of Odessa. We understand that because the Russians, it seems that most likely in 2026 will finish the battle, probably for the Slavyansk-Konstantinovka agglomeration. Maybe the Russians will not be able to establish complete control over Donbass through 2026, but obviously the Russians most likely will be able to finish the battle for these three cities. And when it happens, of course, probably the Russians will start considering other directions for offensive operation. And obviously the Russians also want to finish this conflict, and as we have been discussing the situation since the beginning of 2022, the Russians won't finish this conflict on the territory of Ukraine without certain actions in the direction of Odessa. Probably everybody understands this, so that is why we see that the Ukrainians began fortifying this territory, because they understand that probably the Odessa region is going to be next. Not just because the value of Odessa when talking about the Black Sea and so on, but also because the situation that the Ukrainians use the southwestern parts of the Odessa region for supply and support of for getting supply from Romania and so on. And of course, the Russians would try to fix all issues around Transnistria and Moldova. And as for the Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk direction, we see that the Russians almost every single day are getting closer and closer to the final day of the battle for this area. We see that the city of Konstantinovka, despite the desperate defenses and desperate resistance from the Ukrainian side, we see that the battle is coming to its logical end. During the previous 24 hours, as we we discussed during the previous video, we received additional changes on the ground, and the most important thing is that we received hundreds of videos that confirm Russian strong control over the southern, western, and the southwestern parts of the city. As of now, the Russians continue advancing further in the northwestern direction, and we believe that in coming days we'll start receiving first updates from the north and the northwestern parts of the city. And of course, we believe that in coming days the Russians will start their major offensive operation in the northeastern direction. So probably most of the experts understand that the days of the siege of Konstantinovka are numbered. Then the Russians would try to maintain the lines in this area to shorten the lines, and from these positions the Russians will continue advancing further, first in the direction of Alexeyevo, Drushkovka, and then the Russians will continue battle for the settlement of Drushkovka. And the most important thing is not the thing that the Russians continue advancing. The most important thing is a media situation, because the more the Russians are moving further in the direction of Krasnoyarsk, Kramatorsk, the more media loud and voice we'll see from different sources, especially from the Western countries. And meanwhile, and at the same time, we start receiving reports from pro-Ukrainian sources that the Russian artillery began bombing and attacking the city of Kramatorsk, which is located in the central part of this agglomeration. So, which means that the Russians have already established a certain artillery control over these territories, which means that from now on it's unsafe to use the city of Kramatorsk for the logistic purposes, because the Russians can attack anything with artillery and of course with drones. The Russians are trying to split the Slaviansk-Konstantinovka direction into several pieces, and this is exactly what they're doing from different directions. And the most important thing, as we discussed during the previous video, that also these days we start receiving significant number of updates from the Liman direction. We received a video where we can see Russian soldiers moving through the city of Liman through its eastern part. This is another proof that the Russians have a stronger control over the city than most of the mappers and experts used to believe. The Russians have stronger control over the eastern and the northern parts of the settlement, and as we discussed during the previous videos, according to different sources, up to 85% of the city of Liman is already under complete Russian control. And as you can see, we start receiving updates about the city of Liman and about progress on the ground through this area, at the same time with significant progress on the ground through the city of Konstantinovka itself, which means that the Russians are going to take in pincers the Slaviansk-Konstantinovka agglomeration, and the Russians would try to attack this agglomeration at least from two sides, from the north and from the south. I would like to remind you that the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, Alexander Syrsky, arrived in the city of Konstantinovka personally. Most likely he will command by himself the defense operation of the Slaviansk-Konstantinovka agglomeration, because this is not just a battle for several cities, this is the main battle of the special military operation. Of course, if Syrsky loses this battle, obviously he will lose his position, and Zelensky would replace him for someone else. The sources are saying that probably the head of his office, Budanov, might become the next commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. So the situation is critical, and we see that the Russians continue advancing, and the Russians continue advancing not just through the Donbass direction. With these days we receive lots of updates also from the Zaporozhye direction. As for the previous 24 hours, we received small changes on the ground. The Russians improved their positions through the settlement of Mala Takmachka. According to different sources, the Russians improved their positions further to the west of the settlement of Gulyai-Polska. So the Russians continue offensive operation, and as of the current situation, the Russians are tasked to establish complete control over the next defense layer. We are talking about the settlements of Novoselovka, Kopany, Dolinka, Rovno, Lesnoye. And the thing is that these villages are very small villages in comparison with settlements like Gulyai-Polska, Zaliznichnaya, Verkhnya Tersa, Vozdvizhevka, and Rizdvyanka. These villages are very small, which means that the Russians will be able to move here much faster in comparison with the previous defense layer. And when the Russians finish the battle for this defense layer, and obviously and most likely it will take Russians up to 1 month, the Russians will begin the battle for the next defense layer. We are talking about the territories like this, and this is already basically the beginning of the battle for the city of Orekhov itself. Obviously, the battle for the second defense layer may take up to 1 month as well, which means that somewhere in August or even earlier, the Russians will begin the battle for the city of Orekhov, and with the fall of the city of Orekhov, basically we can start talking about the beginning of the battle for the city of Zaporozhye itself.
I dag, der skal vi ud og køre i den her Folkevogn ID3.
Volkswagen ID3 er en familiebil i mellemklassen.
Another direction that the Russians always attack, where the Russians always have progress on the ground, is the Kharkiv direction. As for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special, no changes on the ground, but I would like to remind you that according to the Group of Forces North, there are clashes for several settlements in this area. According to Russian sources, the close combat is taking place on the territory of the village of Nisterna, and the battle started several days ago. The clashes are taking place for the settlement of Akhrimovka. The battle for this village started almost 3 weeks ago, which means that in coming days this battle may be finished, and the Minister of Defense on the Group of Forces North will confirm additional progress on the ground. Up to 3 days or 5 days last the battle for the settlement of Losovka, which means that in coming days we may receive additional changes on the ground in this area, and then the battle for Sosnovo Bor will start. Furthermore, the Russians started the clashes just 2 days ago for the settlement of Kazachye Lopань, and we start receiving first changes on the ground, which means that the Russians will continue offensive and we'll see more and more changes on the ground. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing along railways, and almost every single day we receive a report that the Russians improve their positions for another 200, 300, or 400 meters in the direction of the settlement of Krasnopolye, which means that in coming days the Russians most likely will be able to improve their positions between the settlements of Taratutina, Lesnoy, and Yasny. So we are talking about these territories. This is exactly where the Russians are advancing right now, and of course the Russians are fighting for the settlements of Pisarevka, Volzhanska, and Novosich. The battle for this territory started almost a month ago. As we can see, the Ukrainians still show fierce resistance, and the Russians haven't managed to establish control over these territories. But the longer the clashes and fightings are taking place, the closer the moment when the Russians will announce complete control over these territories. So basically, as for this territory, we can say that the most important battle for the Sumy direction is taking place. These 3 villages, Pisarevka, Volzhansk, and Novosich, are the most important villages in the Sumy direction, because if Ukrainians lose control over these 3 villages, basically this is going to be something like a breakthrough, and from these positions the Ukrainians will not be able to show fierce resistance almost till the city of Sumy, or at least till the river of Psol that goes through the northern parts of the settlement. So this is the situation, and of course the most northern Sumy direction, currently the clashes are taking place for the settlement of Bachevsk, and the clashes are taking place for the settlement of Ulanova. So as you can see, dozens of villages through the line of combat contact where the Russians are fighting with the Ukrainians, where the Ukrainians are showing fierce resistance just with one purpose: to win another week, month, or another day. And the Russians, as we can see, continue advancing despite the fact that the progress that the Russians' pace of offensive operation have significantly decreased in comparison with the previous year. But it seems that the Russians right now prefer to move slower, but to save as many as possible soldiers and troops, and not to make any risky situation without need. So probably this is the tactics that the Russians have chosen since the beginning of this year, due to, of course, problems with manpower both from Russian and Ukrainian side, and due to the situation with thousands of drones that every day fly over the territory of Ukraine and over the line of combat contact. And that's it for today.